Hello and welcome to yet another fruitful discussion around elections 2024. We call this Elections on Kaya. I'm Ayanda Nyati. And today we decided to hone in on the concept of personality politics. You know, in any election, you'd imagine that it's issues to do with manifestos, policies, where certain parties stand that in fact informs voters about how they should actually cast their ballot. But there's an increasing perception, dare I say, that in a country like ours, who the leader is may actually have a major bearing on how people vote. So let's unpack this and a whole lot more to do with the elections. And bringing our guest for today, Rekgosofetse Chikane is with the Wits School of Governance and joins us now for a sense of where we're at and hopefully where the way forward is. I'm so happy to be sitting with you.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Welcome to Elections on Kaya.
Yeah, this is going to be fun.
It is, and especially because the election so far has proved to be so interesting, right? Yeah. We're spoiled for choice about where to start. But as I mentioned, we're hoping to speak today specifically about this concept of personality politics. For people who are perhaps grappling with the term for the first time, how would you describe it very briefly when we speak about that?
Yeah, so in the South African context, the best way to think about it is South Africans love having a savior.
Yeah.
Why we like having a savior, we could talk about that for hours, but you can really trace it back to particular personalities that really were the face of the apartheid struggle. And that culture and a lot of these personalities who were behind bars really drove the momentum for the apartheid struggle. So the idea that we need to free Nelson Mandela became not just a South African call, but a global call. This idea that we can have particular figures who can drag us from the doldrums into some sort of utopia. And then it happens. Right, you end apartheid and you say, yeah, it's not just the ANC. They look at all these magnificent leaders who have taken us. And politics or political culture then adapts to that. And South African political culture has decided to adapt to essentially saying, how do we elevate personalities to become the face of ideas in particular, rather than an idea being carried along by some personalities? And it's fascinating. You can see this growing throughout the 2000s, so the Mbeki's administration. You see that with the DA, with the rise of Helen Zille when she took over from Tony Leon, as a very big statement of, we are the new party and Helen Zille is the new figure here. You see that in the early 2010s. Julius Malema gets removed from the ANC and he comes back as the savior figure through the EFF in particular, and so on and so forth. Mampela Rampela with Ahang. You see that with Monsieur Logota and Shiloh deciding on who wants to be the savior here with COPE. We see this, and it's not just with new parties. Earlier today, I was talking about Bantu Holomisa in particular, of Bantu Holomisa's holding the UDM by himself, by personality alone. And we see this play out as almost like the playbook, essentially, for how you win an election or how you can become relevant in South Africa's discourse. When people talk about parties, they don't think about the party as a whole. They think about the individuals in the party and how they play that. And I think that's become quite dominant in our discourse.
It's so interesting you say that, because I have a recollection of moments where there were questions around whether, for example, Cyril Ramaphosa is seen in a more positive light than the party he leads, versus how people, for instance, viewed Jacob Zuma when he was in that position. And I wonder whether you reckon organizations in our country are aware of this and playing to it, or if it's something that, happens to exist and people kind of make of it what they will when they can.
So like the ANC is probably the greatest at this. So Ramaphosa takes over the ANC, essentially. But it's not seen as Ramaphosa's faction has taken over the ANC.
Right.
It is he has taken over, right? And it is his new dawn. And it was perfect, and it was designed that way. It was the idea that a lot of particular segments of South African society were looking at the ANC with a side eye of just like, nah, I don't know about this, right? And to get that confidence back, it was find this leader, this businessman, this personality who is absconded from the idea of corruption, and make him the face of this initiative. And you throw everything behind that, the new dawn, et cetera, that type of rhetoric.
Renewal.
The renewal period, right? And then you have a realization that the organization doesn't change just because you put a new face on it. like the foundations of the organization. And I think South Africans are slowly realizing this by the uptake of new parties, the uptake of independence, and the popularity of certain opposition parties. That I think South Africans are realizing, at least for the ANC in particular, that we can't just look at the individual by himself. That we need to understand that you could replace individuals here, but there's something wrong with the organization itself that creates problems. We don't see that yet with other parties. The DA does this as well. The DA really loves putting a really nice fancy face. The problem that they have now is that the fancy face that they've put on, I don't think is gravitating with certain voters in the country. The EFF is interesting, and obviously the new person on the block is MK. Where MK, I don't know a single policy from MK.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone can tell you a single policy of MK, but we know Jacob Zuma's part of it. The personality will ride the wave for the party. How we stop that, should we stop it? I'm not entirely sure. What I do know is that I think it's detrimental because you put too much hope in individuals when the real problem is the organizations themselves.
Sure. The DA, I think, is also an interesting case because when Musi Maimane was there, of course, there'd been at least a message being driven around the DA being welcoming to all, right? Not necessarily being a whites-only party. I mean, look at us with our great black leader. And of course, that kind of all fell on its face when Musi Maimane held a media briefing. And I remember so clearly they were against a plain wall as he was speaking. And he said something to the effect of, I don't think the DA is the vehicle through which we can actually institute change in this country, which is I suppose, a strategy of using people and their faces, again, falling flat.
I mean, sometimes using a face can also work against you. So I love using the DA for this because I can be slightly sympathetic to the DA, right? So Maimane becomes the face for the 2019 elections. He's the one who's supposed to guide the DA to the promised land. They have the elections. And then when you start looking at the numbers at a very granular local level, the push for black voters by having a black leader, right, did not overcome the conservative Afrikaans voters that you lost. Right. And in urban areas, so not in rural areas, it's neither here nor there in rural areas, like they're not really going to get them, but in urban metros, so Joburg and all these kind of, like a Linden, for instance. A Linden had been DA for the last 20 years, nonstop. And then they put a black leader in and Linden goes back to the FF+. Right, so the question then becomes, how willing are you to utilize this face to get new voters, to get into spaces you usually aren't going to get into? But also recognizing that a new face might just erode your base. And that's the danger of having personalities and choosing the wrong personality at a particular time. How do you balance things out? Maimane's argument would be, well, there's just more black voters, right? In the long term, this would be a lot more beneficial. But the party can't kind of comprehend that, right? Because institutionally, the party thinks in a particular way, which is this dynamic between you could have all your faith in a personality, but it's the actual political party that decides what's going on. Outside of a few, like Bantu, UDM is like the one exception to this rule.
Maybe the EFF as well? I mean, there's, at some point there were...
one.
Yeah?
I think that's an interesting one. I think the EFF, until we see the EFF change leaders, we'll never really know.
Precisely.
I think that's the big one. Like the first time there's like some serious challenge to Malema kind of not being in power, then yes. But I think there's a good collective around him of other personalities that people can cling on to. Whenever that happens, though, we then see personalities fighting against each other. And that's what's really happening in the EFF as well. Yeah,
it's been very interesting to watch all of that unfold because part of what that also gives us a window into is the extent to which there is, in fact, active democracies in these organizations. For all their faults, and those are well documented, few people know how an ANC conference is going to pan out until the final results are read. And many will tell you that that is democracy in action, quite frankly, right? In many other organizations...
that's an interesting way to look at it. It's so close that it's that democratic.
Well, I mean, it's hard to call it. And I suppose that's what people use as a matrix of what is and isn't democratic versus again in EFF, where at the beginning of the conference, unless there's like any major upset, we kind of know who's likely to be the leader of that organization, at least in the past couple of years.
So, I mean, I could push back on the ANC.
Yeah.
I think from the outside, those who are in the party who've kind of gone through the exercise of like getting delegates from a branch, the region, etc., like a week out from the conference, which is still tight, right? You'll have a general idea about where things are going to go unless something very, very dramatic happens, because there's a playbook for this, like, so we can kind of see it. But we can hop on like the internal things, because you're completely right. Ordinary South Africans don't know how internal democracies function in political parties across the board. I could pick out an ordinary South African and be like, how did John Steenhuisen become the leader of the party?
Yeah.
Like, how was he voted in? How is the EFF voted in? All of them have very similar processes, right? Really closed list. And it's because of the nature of our political system. Our political system, 100% proportional representation, great, I guess. But it's the closed list aspect of it. Ensures that the public is not incentivized. No, political parties are not incentivized to allow the public to know what's internally happening in their party. We will tell you after the fact. And because of that, if there's no chaos in your party, it is easy to keep the status quo. It is easy to have complete control about who will become the leader. You can have that kind of successional planning. If there's chaos in your party, then it becomes quite loud. And we might be looking at the ANC and being like, oh my God, we don't know what's really happening. There's this chaos, there's factions and this and this and that. But when you ask someone like, what does that faction mean? Like really, at the end of the day, are you saying that it is a fight between Limpopo and the Western Cape? Is that the real faction? Is it a faction of personalities? Is it a faction on ideological issues? Usually a week out, once you start counting the numbers, you'll have an idea about what's happening in the ANC. But that's if you're in it and you're looking for it and you're talking to individuals, which then tells me that internal democracy of parties is not designed for the public to know about. The public must only care about us when we're public facing, when we've already gone through our internal processes. And for me, if a party is representing me in parliament, because that's really our entire democratic system, the question that I have is, well, if you represent me, I would like to know how you got chosen to be eligible to represent me.
Absolutely.
And I think that becomes the issue.
Sure. Speaking about parliamentary representation, of course, it's an unprecedented election.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've said that already, but it is, right? And a big part of the reason for that is because we have so many people contesting, including smaller parties, which, let's face it, are taking up space, to borrow that term.
Yeah.
And I wondered, to what extent do you reckon that has to do with the leaders of these organizations too, versus even just their policies, et cetera, and of course, in this case, I'm referring to the Rise Mzansi's, the Build One South Africa's. I suppose we can still mention Action SA, even though they contested the local government elections in 2019, but around that kind of band of politics, so to speak.
Yeah, so there's such a fascinating debate that's happening around the idea of smaller parties in South Africa, in particular like coalitions, but at a national level, about how much should we tolerate the explosion of smaller parties and new parties? Like, what's our tolerance limit of it, right? Because of the design of our system, 100% proportional representation essentially means every single vote counts. So you could go into elections and get essentially like 60,000 votes out of the 20-odd million votes available, 60,000 votes and still get a seat in parliament. It might go up to 70, right? So getting a seat in parliament technically is not that difficult if you're really mobilizing. So it incentivizes having as many people in. The question is, do you want an Al-Jama situation that we have in Johannesburg? Nothing against Al-Jama, but do you want an Al-Jama situation in Johannesburg in national government? So the interesting debate is, should there be a threshold for newer parties and smaller parties? That just because you're a party doesn't necessarily mean that you must be in seats of power. Right? And I think that's an interesting debate. I know people argue, I think there should be a threshold. That if you are a smaller party or a newer party, if you're Rise Mzansi, if you're Action SA, prove your worth in the ballots. Right? Prove your worth.
And what do we do with those 60,000 votes, which you've just mentioned then?
That becomes a fascinating one.
Right.
Right? Because 100% proportional representation means every single vote in our country counts for something in one way or another. In a constituency type system, you can just lose. There's wasted votes, right? If my candidate in my constituency doesn't get voted in, then all the votes that I gave for my person don't count for anything, right? So there's a give and take. But there's ways to manage this. You could say proportional representation, new parties you can play around, but at an executive level, you have to hit a particular threshold to get to an executive level or to have particular seats because you're representing a larger proportion of society. This does not mean that I don't think we need new parties. I think politics in South Africa has become very, very stale, right? It's really just been ANC dominance, the DA shouting at the ANC, and then the EFF now coming with like a revolutionary energy into the space. And the traditional smaller parties, I'm now in particular talking about like COPE and UDM, the ACDPs of the world, parties that in my mind no longer shake public discourse in any particular way outside individual leaders. I think there's a time for them to leave. I would rather have newer parties such as Rise Mzansi, such as the Action SAs, whether I agree with them or not, to get into places of power because they now represent the current political discourse of the country. And I think the increased attachment people have towards parliament is only good for society in one way or another. And if there are new parties that are really galvanizing people's voices, and it could be across the board, I'm really neither here nor there. Right. It could be MK. It could be if Operation Dudula gets into the Gauteng provincial legislature. These are organizations that are representing the will of the people. And who are we to say we would rather have the traditional stalwarts? If they're not putting in the work and they're not getting the votes, then they should be asking that question, do we count for the threshold anymore?
Sure. You raise such a fascinating point because part of what I've been able to pick up is that there are so many more people actively talking about the politics of the elections. And in many instances, those are people who have an interest in the new entrants, right? Yep. Just the number of people, for example, asking questions about the MK party I found is incredibly fascinating. So in a way, this could even answer questions around voter apathy potentially, because of this new energy you speak about.
Yeah, so I'm part of like a very small and increasingly small contingent of society who don't think this year's elections are of consequence, right? In the sense of if the ANC will lose or not, right? So I'm of the belief the ANC will win and kind of squeak through and whatnot. But the importance of this election is that it sets the foundations for the big fight of 2029, right? The big fight being there are new voices in our political discourse. So all the traditional opposition parties who had always kind of been there, they have to go through a shakeup of some sort, right? So the UDMs, the COPEs, not ATMs, the IFPs, the FF pluses, the ACDPs, they are going to have a moment of reckoning, right? That if they can't win whilst attempting to do coalition politics, whilst trying to do this and this and that, it will show younger voters in particular that you are not our option. And the amount of votes they'll get will continue to decrease, right? Someone needs to take up those votes. The ANC is not going to take up those votes, right? We've seen the steady decline of the ANC. The DA, maybe they could possibly do it. The EFF possibly could do it as well. But there's too many lost votes to the traditional opposition parties for the three major parties to take up. So it opens up a gap, a moment of opportunity. And we're seeing this now. We're seeing it with the Patriotic Alliance and the inroads that they're making in the Western Cape. We're seeing it through Rise Mzansi, who have come out hot with a ton of money, who've made an interesting impact in localized mobilization for national politics. It's a fascinating model that they have, that they'll most likely get votes. And in my mind, these new entrants, including like the kind of new ones, like the ATMs of the world, will then set the tone for 2029 to be a discussion of, okay, we've got the traditional guys, plus the traditional opposition parties. You guys have kind of been floundering around doing your thing. You haven't really beaten the ANC.
Yeah.
And now we have brand new voices in parliament. Can we make this a proper fight for 2029? And I think that's the importance of 2024 for me, that it really sets the stage for the big fight that's going to happen in 5 years' time.
Fascinating. All right. As we round up, I wonder in the lead up to 2029, to what extent do you reckon there is such a thing as a strategic vote? What do I mean by that? We know that these are provincial and national elections. In many instances, people resonate with how a party is able to govern where they live, but aren't comfortable with the party running the country where they stay, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I wonder if you've given any thought to that kind of thing and whether or not that may be a kind of interesting placeholder as we count down to 2029.
Yeah, it's probably the most frustrating thing the DA has to deal with.
Yeah.
Where people are like, yeah, we're fine with you governing.
Precisely.
Yeah, but nationally, no. we don't.
I wasn't going to mention any names, but okay.
We don't want you guys to be there. But I think it's fascinating. So
Yeah.
South Africans traditionally for the ANC, they'll double vote, right? So they'll do national, provincial, generally speaking. Opposition parties in particular, that vote gets split, traditionally speaking, that people will generally vote for the status quo and are willing to give someone a chance at like, when it's closer to home, I'm willing to give you a chance. The national one is almost like we're afraid of. So for me, the strategic vote changes this year, right? Because of the third ballot that we have, right? So usually I would be like, vote for the same party on both ballots, regardless of what happens. Like be consistent, create new voters within the kind of ecosystem that we have. I've got a suggestion now for individuals. This is the way I will vote. Who I'm going to vote for, still don't know. But the way I will vote is party at a national level. At a regional level, if we had more independence, and this is why independence is so important. If we had more independence on the ballot, I would have said always vote independent at the regional level, so that the split in parliament is 200 political parties and 200 independent individuals. Because not necessarily because the independents will do a good job, but it's the quickest way to create like substantive, systematic change in parliament, right? So even if the ANC loses by like 48, 47, 45, they can still scrummage about a coalition.
Sure.
But if all the political parties are sitting on one side and they have to negotiate with direct representatives
it's
of
much
communities, it's a lot harder, right? And you get this competitive democracy. And at a provincial level, vote for the person that you think will fix water. Really that, because at a provincial level, no one's going to fix electricity for you, right? But they can fix water, right? And people need to think less about like service delivery in my community, right? But rather like major service delivery issues that I'm afraid will be taken away from me, or I'm afraid will become defunct in the future. That's really the only role provinces kind of have. And that would be like my strategic vote. Don't vote because there's potholes in front of your house. Think about, well, if we fix the water issues in Soweto in particular, then the chances of people being angry in Soweto decreases. And if that decreases, then there's a level of stability in my city, if that makes sense. At a local government level, it's your ward council, then you can keep it completely at home. And I think that's the way people kind of need to change their thinking for the provincial vote. And honestly, provincial votes in the hierarchy of things don't matter. People are going to get angry with me for saying this.
They can see me frowning.
Because provinces don't have power, right? Most power that citizens face will be national and local elections. Where provinces has always been this weird compromise about the abilities that they have to influence you on your day-to-day life, especially if you live in a major metro. If you live in like a district municipality, is a very different conversation that we're having. And it makes the provincial vote difficult about the strategy for it. So my last thing will be, if you're going to vote in particular provinces, then the only provinces that matter in a consequential manner for our elections is the Western Cape, Gauteng, and KZN. They will be the provinces where if something funny happens at a national level, to resolve the national question, we'll have to see what happens at a provincial level. Can I give a quick example? If the IFP, for instance, says they're part of the Moonshot multi-charity party, whatever thing, right? IFP signed on to it. If the ANC gets 47%, and the IFP is sitting there with 4%, I can almost guarantee you the IFP will say, give us KZN, make us premier, we'll give you the country. It's a very simple trade-off.
Right.
There's nothing complicated about it, especially in a very contested KZN province, right? We're seeing the exact type of thing happening in the Western Cape. If the patriotic alliance is to garner enough votes, good parties is able to garner enough votes, and for whatever reason, push the DA underneath 50, you're going to have the same type of question. Gauteng will be, I can't even imagine what it's going to look like. If you're paying attention to the political maneuvers that people make, think about how your province will strategically impact national elections. And if the ANC were to get under 50%, at a provincial level, vote for who you think would want to be a coalition partner with the ANC. Now, that's like high level thing, but if you wanted to have a strategy, that's the way I would do it. National, vote for whoever you want. Regional, vote for independents. Provinces, vote strategically for who you think would be the best coalition partner for someone at a national level.
It is fascinating. And I suppose at this stage, one can only consider the different scenarios and permutations until we get the results.
Until we get there.
After the 29th of May. But for now, let me thank you so much for speaking to us. Appreciate your insights as always. Rogoso Fetsi Chikane is with the Wits School of Governance as we continue counting down to the 29th of May. You've been watching Elections on Kaya. Stay tuned for our next episode too.